My wife said, "You're not man enough to handle my independence." I replied, "You're right." Then I filed for divorce and moved her mom into our guest room. Her lawyer called me laughing when he saw the paperwork. I'm 38, male, structural engineer. I build bridges and load-bearing foundations for a living. I spend my days calculating exactly how much stress a structure can take before it fails. Turns out that skill transfers to marriage too, just not in the way I would have wanted. My wife and I got together when we were both 26. She was sharp, funny, had this energy that made every room feel like it was waiting for her. I married that. What I didn't fully understand until years later was the difference between confidence and contempt. Because those two things can look identical from a distance. The contempt showed up slowly, like a hairline fracture in concrete. You don't notice it until the whole section starts to shift. It started around year 6. She got promoted to senior marketing director at her firm, and something changed. Not in a she grew as a person way, more like a she started keeping score way. Every dinner I cooked became evidence that she was carrying the household emotionally. Every weekend I spent on a deadline became proof that I didn't prioritize her. Meanwhile, her 70-hour work weeks were called ambition. Mine were called avoidance. I adjusted. I communicated. I suggested couples therapy. We went twice. The second time I went alone because she said therapy was for people who can't figure things out themselves. I should have paid way more attention to that sentence. The phrase that ended everything came on a Tuesday night in November. We were arguing about something small. I think it was about me skipping her colleague's birthday party because I had a site inspection at 5 a.m. the next morning. The argument escalated the way they always did, her words getting sharper, mine getting quieter. Then she said it. "You're not man enough to handle my independence." She said it like she'd been saving it, like it had been sitting in a drawer for months, waiting for the right moment. I stood there. I looked at her, and something that had been loosening inside me for years just let go. "You're right," I said. She expected a fight. I didn't give her one. I walked to the guest room, closed the door, and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling until my alarm went off at 4:15 a.m., went to work, did my site inspection, and on my lunch break, I called a divorce attorney. Now, before I get into what happened next, I need to give you some background because none of this makes sense without it. My mother-in-law had been living alone in a condo about 40 minutes from us for 3 years, ever since my father-in-law passed. She was 71, had mild mobility issues from a bad knee, and was without question the most passive-aggressively manipulative person I had ever met in my life. She never liked me, not from day one. I wasn't from the right background, didn't make enough money early on, and worst of all, I occasionally disagreed with her daughter. She used to say things like, "My daughter deserves someone who appreciates what she brings to the table," always smiling when she said it. Over the years, she became my wife's primary emotional support system, life coach, and, as I would later find out, her strategic advisor. About 6 months before the Tuesday night comment, I noticed my wife was on long phone calls with her mother almost every evening, behind closed doors. I didn't think much of it at first, but then small things started happening. Our joint bank account, which we'd had for 9 years, started showing a new pattern, consistent transfers. 200 here, 350 there. I tracked it over 8 weeks. Roughly $4,000 moved to an account I didn't recognize. I didn't confront her. I documented everything. Then I found the email. Not by going through her stuff. She left her laptop open on the kitchen counter, and a notification popped up while I was walking past. I saw enough of the subject line to stop walking. It was from a law firm. The preview read, Asset Protection Strategy, Next Steps. She had been consulting a divorce attorney for at least 3 months before she said a single word to me. So when she told me I wasn't man enough to handle her independence, what she was really saying was, "I've already planned my exit, I've already moved money, and I'm waiting for you to react badly, so I have something to use against you." I didn't react badly. I reacted perfectly. My attorney was a quiet guy in his early 50s who'd been doing family law for over 20 years. When I walked into his office and laid out what I had, the bank statements, the timeline of transfers, the email preview, the screenshots. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Most people come in here angry. You came in here prepared. That's a different case entirely. In my state, dissipation of marital assets, meaning transferring money out of joint accounts in anticipation of divorce, is taken seriously by the court. It doesn't guarantee you win everything, but it creates a very unfavorable impression of the party who did it. My attorney filed the paperwork with a detailed financial exhibit attached. I signed everything on a Thursday afternoon. But before the legal stuff picks up speed, I need to tell you about the chess move, because this is where things get interesting. 3 days after I met with my attorney, I called my mother-in-law. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice completely warm, "I've been thinking. The guest room has just been sitting empty, and I know your knee has been giving you trouble. Why don't you come stay with us for a while? Take some pressure off." Silence on the other end. "Really?" she said. "Absolutely. We'd love to have you." My wife overheard the end of the call and came into the kitchen with a look of pure confusion. "Did you just invite my mother to stay here?" "She's been struggling." I said, pouring myself a glass of water. "It's the right thing to do." She didn't know what to do with that. Neither did her mother. What neither of them knew was that I had already filed. The papers would be served in 6 days. My mother-in-law arrived on a Saturday with 2 suitcases, a slow cooker, and the energy of a woman who thought she'd just won something. She walked through our front door, looked around like she was doing an appraisal, and said, "It's smaller than I remembered." I smiled, carried her bags to the guest room, and made everyone coffee. My wife watched me the entire morning with the suspicious look she was trying to hide behind casual conversation. I was too calm, too accommodating. It didn't fit the version of me she'd been building a legal case around. She pulled me aside that afternoon. "What's going on with you?" "What do you mean?" "You've just been different." "I've been thinking about what you said." I told her, "You were right. I need to stop fighting how things are and just accept reality." She nodded slowly, not sure whether to be relieved or alarmed. 4 days later, on a Wednesday at 11:14 a.m., a process server knocked on her office door and handed her the divorce papers. She called me 47 times between 11:20 and 1 p.m. I let every single one go to voicemail. I responded once by text, "I think it's best we communicate through our attorneys from here. Take care." That evening she came home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, eating the soup I'd made, watching TV. My wife stood in the doorway, still in her work coat, holding the divorce papers, looking at her mother in our guest room like she was seeing a trap spring shut. "Did you know about this?" she asked her mother. Her mother looked genuinely confused. "He invited me. He seemed fine." That was the moment I think my wife realized the invitation hadn't been an olive branch. Now here's where her plans started falling apart in ways she clearly didn't anticipate. Her asset protection strategy was built on a narrative where I was the emotionally unavailable, checked-out partner, and she was a self-sufficient breadwinner who had been holding everything together. It was a clean story. It would have worked reasonably well in mediation, maybe even in front of a judge, if I had played the role she'd written for me. But her narrative had a problem. I had receipts, not just the financial transfers. I had 3 years of couples therapy intake forms documenting my consistent efforts to work on the marriage. I had emails where I'd suggested counseling, weekend trips to reconnect, and structured conversations. I had a paper trail that showed a man who tried, repeatedly. I also had records showing she attended exactly 1 therapy session in the previous year, during which the therapist documented her stating the marriage was essentially over and had felt that way for some time. That session note ended up in discovery. Her first countermove was to try and get her mother out of the house. She came to me directly, which her attorney had specifically told her not to do, and said, "You need to tell my mother this arrangement isn't working." "She just got here," I said, "and you always said I never made her feel welcome." "I'm correcting that. She's living in our house while we're going through a divorce. She's living in my house. My name is on the mortgage, and per the standing order that automatically went into effect when I filed, neither of us can make significant changes to the marital home environment without court approval. I'd hate for you to accidentally run into a contempt issue." She didn't say another word. Her second move was to use her mother against me. She convinced her to start keeping a notebook documenting my behavior, little entries about things I'd supposedly done wrong. I noticed a notebook on the kitchen counter one morning and said nothing. Instead, I started being aggressively, deliberately kind. I drove my mother-in-law to her physical therapy appointments. I cooked meals at work with her dietary restrictions. I fixed the handle on her suitcase without being asked. When that notebook surfaced in proceedings, the entries included things like made dinner without asking what I wanted and did not respond to comment about parking immediately. Her attorney moved past that section of evidence so fast it was almost athletic. Her third move was the most serious. Through her attorney, she claimed I had been emotionally withholding in a pattern consistent with emotional abuse throughout the marriage, hoping to shift the tone of the proceedings and potentially affect asset division. My attorney was ready. We submitted the therapy intake forms. The emails, years of text threads where I was consistently the one asking to connect, asking to talk, asking to plan time together. And we submitted the therapist's notes showing my wife had said the marriage was over months before she ever mentioned divorce to me. The emotional abuse claim quietly disappeared from her filings about 2 weeks later. In my state, once divorce papers are filed, a standing order automatically kicks, and that prohibits both parties from transferring or hiding marital assets. My wife had moved approximately $4,200 out of our joint account in the months prior to filing. The transfer stopped the moment papers were served, presumably because her attorney told her to stop the second she called him, but the record was already there. The dissipation hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, about 4 months after I filed. By this point, my mother-in-law had been living in the guest room for nearly 3 months. Here's the thing about living with someone. Even someone who came in as an adversary, people are more complicated than the roles they get assigned. My mother-in-law, stripped of the performance she put on when her daughter was watching, was actually just a lonely 71-year-old woman who was scared of being irrelevant. She'd been widowed 3 years. She'd poured everything into her daughter, and her daughter, increasingly consumed by the legal fight, had started treating her less like an ally and more like a prop. One evening about 6 weeks before the hearing, I came home to find my mother-in-law sitting in the kitchen in the dark. Not dramatically. She'd just forgotten to turn the light on. I made tea. We sat there for a while. She said quietly, she doesn't call me anymore unless she needs something. I didn't say anything for a bit. That's hard, I said. She nodded. 3 weeks before the hearing, my mother-in-law called my attorney's office directly. I found out when my attorney called me. Your mother-in-law wants to submit a voluntary statement, he said. There was a pause. In your favor. She submitted a 4-page written statement. In it, she described, in her own words, conversations she'd had with my wife over the past 2 years. She described being present when my wife discussed the asset protection strategy. She named specific dates, approximate amounts, and specific instructions her daughter had given her about not letting on that anything was changing at home. She also stated plainly that she had never witnessed me behave in any of the ways I was being accused of, that the notebook she'd been asked to keep had felt wrong to her from beginning. She ended the statement with one line that my attorney later told me the judge read twice. My daughter is my daughter, and I love her. But what she did to this man wasn't independence. It was dishonesty, and I didn't raise her to be dishonest. At the dissipation, hearing my wife's attorney did his best. He argued the transfers were routine household management, that there was no proof of intent, that the timing was coincidental. He was good, and he presented it professionally. Then my attorney presented the email chain obtained through discovery between my wife and her asset protection attorney, which had started 9 months before the divorce was filed. The chain included specific language about timing transfers to avoid scrutiny and keeping amounts below certain thresholds. Most damaging was an email where my wife wrote, I want to make sure things are in a clean position before anything becomes official. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had clearly seen every version of this story, looked at the email, looked at the financial records, looked at my wife's attorney, and said, Counsel, I'm going to need your client to explain the phrase clean position. Her attorney asked for a recess. During the recess, I was told later by a paralegal who apparently had strong feelings about the case by that point, my wife spent most of the break arguing that she still had leverage. She did not have leverage. When proceedings resumed, the judge ordered a full accounting of all transfers made from joint accounts in the 18 months prior to filing. She found credible evidence of intentional dissipation and ordered the amounts returned to the marital estate for division, plus awarded a financial offset in my favor that neutralized the entire pre-planned strategy. The house went to me. I was the sole name on the mortgage, something my wife had agreed to years earlier because she didn't want a liability on her credit profile. The joint investment account was divided, but with the offset applied, I came out with approximately 58% of the liquid assets. Her attorney's fees, for a case she had entered believing she held all the cards, were substantial. Outside the courthouse, my wife stood next to her car and looked at me. For the first time in a long time, I saw something on her face that wasn't contempt. "You planned this in the beginning," she said. I responded to what was already in motion. I told her, "You set the board. I just played it." She got in her car and left. The divorce was finalized about 3 months after the hearing. My mother-in-law had stayed through the whole process. When it was done, I sat down with her and had a straight conversation. I told her she could stay as long as she needed to figure out her next step, but that I was going to be moving forward and reconfiguring things. She told me she called her son, my wife's older brother, who lived out in Arizona. They'd patched things up. He'd said she could come stay with him. She left 6 weeks later. On her last morning, she left a card on the kitchen counter. Inside it said, "You were a better son-in-law than you ever got credit for. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." That card is still in my desk drawer. I'm 38. I own my house outright after refinancing. I spend my weekends on things I actually care about. Last fall, I volunteered with a local habitat organization and built 3 wheelchair ramps for elderly residents in my county. The thing about being a structural engineer is you understand load transfer. When one support point fails, a load doesn't disappear, it redistributes. The structure either finds new equilibrium or it collapses, depending on whether you designed it properly. I had spent years trying to maintain something my wife was quietly undermining from the foundation. I couldn't have saved it. What I could do, what I did do, was make sure when it came down measured, documented, and controlled. She thought she married a man who wouldn't notice. She was wrong about that.